on to section 5.4. And at this point, we're going to start looking at some of the impacts of agricultural practices that are in place today. So to begin, get out your journal, and I would like you to pause at the end of this slide and take about 5 to 10 minutes to write out your response. Okay, so the prompt for today reads, every single one of your consumer habits has some sort of an effect on the environment. Think about all of the food products that you buy. How might the production of the food products that you like, okay, so things like fruits, vegetables, grains, meats, things that you buy a lot of, that's what I want you to think about. How does the production of those things affect the environment? Which products do you think have the most negative of the impacts, and why? So go ahead and pause the video and take a few minutes to write out a good response to this, and then we will continue. Okay, so moving on. How does agriculture harm the environment? Well, all of the things that we looked at yesterday, all the industrialized agriculture, those big machines, the synthetic chemicals that are used as fertilizers or pesticides, how do those affect the environment, right? We talked about the benefits, right? Increasing our yield, so the amount of fruits, vegetables, and whatnot that we can get from a certain expanse of land and the resources that we use. But now the question is, how can these things be harmful to the environment? And we will see that despite the benefits, despite all of this additional yield, all of the extra food that we're able to harvest now, despite that, there are going to be some very significant environmental impacts. So that is not good, especially if we're considering whether these actions that we are doing right now, whether they are sustainable or not. Okay, so we have to not only be concerned about what we're getting now, but also about what we would be able to get in the future. And if our actions now are going to have harmful impacts that will limit future food production, then that's something that we have to really reconsider moving forward. So we're going to be talking about a bunch of these things throughout this chapter and throughout the rest of this course. But this is a nice graphic that your textbook provides. I will certainly let you check it out on your own, but I'm not going to go through, and just read off all these points. You can certainly look at this and refer in your book to these things, all right? But, in general, the industrialized agriculture that we utilize for food production can lead to negative impacts on biodiversity, so biodiversity loss, negative impacts on the quality of soil, on the quality of water ecosystems, leads to air pollution, and then there can also be some, far-reaching effects on human health as well. And those are all things that it is really important to pay attention to and be aware of, that despite all of the benefits of our agricultural practices, there are some very significant and a wide range of negative impacts as well. So a little bit of data for you. So for agriculture, 70% of the water that goes to the production of food, 70% of that water is taken from aquifers, so down in the groundwater, as well as surface, so like from rivers or lakes. Okay, so that's a really significant amount of water that we need to take from elsewhere for irrigation. Almost 40%, so 38% of the world's ice-free land is used for food production, and that number could have certainly gone up since this book was produced about even 2 years ago. Okay, 25% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions results from agriculture and the production of food. So you might think that cars, power plants, they have a significant contribution, and that's obviously true. But did you ever consider that agriculture is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions such as carbon dioxide and methane and nitrogen oxides? Okay. And then 60% of all water pollution results from agriculture. So the runoff from pastures, okay? So all of the feces, the manure, the fertilizers for the crops, the pesticides, 60% of all water pollution results from agriculture. And that is very, very significant. Okay, now what about erosion? So now we're talking about soil and topsoil. That is what is at the very top. That's our A layer. It is the foundation of terrestrial life, right? Because if not for the topsoil and the water that it can hold, the nutrients that it has, the organic matter that will get broken down in it, if not for topsoil, we wouldn't have no terrestrial life, right? There would be no plants that would be able to live without the nutrients and stuff like that. And those are the basis, right? Photosynthesis of any terrestrial ecosystem and food chain or food web. So the good thing about topsoil is that topsoil is a renewable resource. It stores water and nutrients for plants, like we said. So it is necessary for sustaining agriculture. So it is something that we need to grow our plants, to grow our crops. It is luckily renewable. But the problem is that agricultural practices and the tilling and the erosion from the exposed soil, wind and water, so the runoff or the wind that blows over it, those things can remove and erode our soil and take the topsoil, take the nutrients along with it away from the land where we want to have it to help to grow our crops. Okay, so there are 3 different types of erosion. There is sheet erosion, which is just, you just have water that runs off over the entire expanse. Rills that form, like very thin, what's the word that I'm looking for? They form really thin, like rivulets, just really small. They just kind of dig into the soil, and then the water will flow through it almost like a tiny, tiny stream. Okay, and then when those come together, they would form gullies. So, it's almost like the where a stream would begin, right? They get small, or they start very small, and then they come together and they form bigger and bigger gullies like you have here. Okay, so wind erosion, just blowing right on top of our exposed soil and taking away the soil as it picks up the dust. You can see gully erosion, how significant that is. What a big, not only is that going to be a passageway for water to move through it, but think about how that's breaking apart the land. And it's not just a problem for removing the soil and the nutrients, but think about how difficult it would be to get vehicles to move over this now, okay, as it breaks apart the land. Okay, so this map shows us where throughout the world topsoil erosion is a concern. So the white, it means that the topsoil is stable. Blue means that there is some concern about the topsoil, and then red means that there is serious concern. So like in the Midwestern United States, in parts of Europe, and over into Asia, a lot of Africa, and down into South America, topsoil erosion is a serious concern, whether that's from agriculture or just from how the land is set up. Okay, so this just shows you how much of an issue this is throughout the world. Now, still staying with the soil, we have a concept known as desertification. Now, this is not really, this sounds better than what it actually is, right? Desertification kind of makes me think of desserts. But this is really talking about deserts. So the formation of a desert ecosystem. So it is a process where the topsoil and its potential to produce crops decreases as drought events and topsoil erosion occur. So a lot of places throughout the world, humans try to grow crops where the ecosystem is really dry. Why? Because it's hot and because it gets lots of sunlight. So you got at least one of the two important ingredients there, but without the water, it's going to be tough. So that's where irrigation is going to be really important. But what is actually happening is, in trying to use these lands for agriculture, it's going to lead to additional topsoil erosion to remove what actually was there that was good in the first place. And then the droughts that can be brought on by removing the natural vegetation will lead to a drying out of the soil. And that's essentially going to mean that a desert is going to form over time. So that can create a new desert, or it can expand existing deserts. And that is a really big problem, because then that means that that land that was at least somewhat useful for growing crops is now not useful at all. So it results from deforestation and removing the natural ecosystems, like even a tropical rainforest. You remove that, then it's going to be really difficult for it to grow back, and that can lead to desertification. All right, excess plowing. So what plowing is that it is turning over the soil so that the nutrients come closer to the surface for the plants to use. But what also that does is that it disrupts the soil, and it is going to lead to additional erosion as a result of it becoming looser. Okay, and then overgrazing in pastures, feedlots, the cattle or whatever livestock there is just eat the vegetation there in excess, and that will mean that that stuff might not be able to grow back if the ecosystem is being overgrazed, and that would lead to desertification. Okay, and then so if the nutrients are not replaced, then that is a really big problem. If the topsoil erodes and nutrients go with it, and the nutrients are not replaced through fertilizer or whatever, then that significantly lowers the productive potential of the land. Livestock, not only overgrazing but also trampling the land, will make it worse. And then climate change leads to prolonged droughts in some areas, and that could also worsen and increase the rate at which deserts are forming. So this is a really, really big concern, especially with agriculture, in removing natural ecosystems, in using them in ways that is not really ideal, right? Ecosystems that are not really meant to grow a lot of crops, like in really dry ecosystems that are being used to grow crops that may not have necessarily been a desert before, but will eventually become a desert due to the overuse or using it in certain ways like humans do. Okay, so the Dust Bowl in the United States, in the Midwest, as a result of the formation of these agricultural lands, this is like an extreme example of not just desertification, but of the wind erosion. So removing like the soil and blowing it, like you can see here, that is like a really, really intense example. Now, talking about water, as I mentioned before, 70% of all water, sorry, this is a different statistic, but 70% of all water that humans use is for irrigation and for agriculture. So if you're asked a question, what is the highest use of water by humans, then you should say agriculture for sure. So land that is irrigated produces 44% of the world's food. And that is a really, really big amount. But irrigation can lead to a condition known as salinization. So essentially what's happening is the soil and the plants are using up the water, but the water has salts in it, and as the water that is being irrigated and moved from one place to the next, it's picking up these salts, and as it then goes to where it needs to go, the plants are going to absorb the water, but then the sodium and the chloride are left behind, and then that just means that the soil is then absorbing the sodium and the chloride and not the water, so it's leaving these salts behind, and that will eventually be detrimental because the salts are actually not good for plants and their ability to grow. So the presence of the heightened concentrations or whatever you want to say of the salts will mean that the crops are not going to grow to their full potential, and that will lower the overall crop yield as a result of these salts just being picked up by the irrigation water and then being left behind on the land as the plants use the water and then leave the salts there. So the salts are going to accumulate over time, and that will lead to the lower crop yields eventually. Okay, so that's what we see here. The water that's being absorbed by the plants, or the water that is also being evaporated into the sky, which is another big problem of irrigation too. They leave behind these salts, and that means that this soil right here is going to be not ideal at all for growing crops. Waterlogging is kind of like on the other side of it, where at this point the soil is not able to absorb as much water. So, over time, the irrigation is going to mean that the water is being absorbed by the ground, but so much is going to accumulate that the ground is just not going to be able to absorb any more of the water. And by raising the water table and maybe even all the way up to the surface, as we can see here, this means that all the spaces in the soil and in the ground here between all of the sand, the silt, and the clay, there's not going to be any room for gases, and that is one of the biggest, um, other than water and nutrients, there has to be air in the soil so that the soil needs to be aerated. And without that, the plants are not going to be able to grow because they're not going to be able to get the oxygen from the soil that they need to perform cellular respiration. Okay. So, another problem with irrigation, not just the evaporation that can happen, but using the water to try to get those salts deeper as a result of our previous problem, will lead to a heightened water table, and will mean that there's just no room anymore, because if the soil is completely filled with water, there's going to be no room for gases. And that is a big problem for plants. Okay, plants need their oxygen just like we need our oxygen. Water pollution is another big deal. So again, with erosion, the water that runs off from an agricultural field or from a pasture is going to be picking up whatever is there, pesticides, feces, bacteria from feces, nutrients from the fertilizers, all that stuff. But that is going to get into the aquatic ecosystem. And it's not just all those things that I was saying, but the soil itself too, as you can see here, is going to make the water in the runoff and then what enters the aquatic ecosystem much more murky, and raise what is called the turbidity and make it much more cloudy. And that is a big problem for fish that might depend on being able to see. It will be bad for plants that need to photosynthesize by getting the sunlight. And if there is lots of topsoil there, it might make it more difficult for things like shellfish to be able to kind of like get a hold in the ecosystem. Over fertilization, we got these really bright like green colors, almost like my car, as a result of over fertilization, which will lead to, if the land is being over fertilized, then that means that the plants are not going to be using all of it. So when water runs off, just like what we saw before, the fertilizer is going to get into that runoff, and it's going to be taken to the aquatic ecosystems nearby. And that will cause the process known as eutrophication, which is just the excess growth of plant matter like algae in an aquatic ecosystem. It makes it super green and really kind of murky. And that will be a very big problem for the ecosystem, as we will talk about later. Pesticides can also get into aquatic ecosystems, and I mean, they're meant to kill things. So if the pesticides get into the ecosystems, then they're going to kill plants and animals in that ecosystem. And not only that, but a lot of pesticides do not break down very quickly. So they will biomagnify, which just means that in a food chain, the animals near the top will have a much higher concentration of these pesticides as a result of eating the lower trophic levels. Essentially, what's happening as one organism eats another, as they eat more and more, they're getting all of the pesticides that had been absorbed by the previous organism, and they're not going to be able to get rid of it or break them down. So they get more and more in their system as they eat more and more organisms below them. A reduction in biodiversity is another harmful impact of agriculture. So, essentially natural ecosystems are being replaced by croplands and pastures. This is a really big problem, as I had mentioned before, in Brazil, where they are removing the lush tropical rainforest that has so much biodiversity to use for land for monoculture like soybeans or sugarcane, or for the raising of cattle. A concept known as agrobiodiversity. So since 1900, we have lost much of the genetic diversity of the agricultural plants, whether that's because we have been getting them more, we have been breeding them more selectively to get what we want. And then once we get what we want, then we just go with that. Or we're cloning things like bananas so that they don't have seeds, which means that if they're clones and they're direct copies, then there will be zero genetic diversity in those bananas, which is actually kind of a problem that we'll talk about later. And 97% of our food plant varieties that were once available in the United States no longer exist except for in seed banks. So that is just kind of a really staggering thing, that over time we have gotten less and less genetic diversity and less varieties of food plants. Tilling, which I had mentioned before. So what's happening here is the soil is being overturned, and that is going to help to bring the nutrients closer to the surface, loosening up the soil so that it's easier to plant, and that is good for the plants and planting them. But the problem is that in overturning the soil like this, it leaves it open to additional erosion. Slash and burn practices, aka fire fallow cultivation, just means that burning down the natural ecosystem to get the land ready for planting. But what this actually does is that's going to leave all the nutrients from the forest that was here in the soil. So that's actually kind of advantage of slashing and burning. So by cutting down and burning the plants, it's going to be a pretty nutrient rich land, at least for a little while. And that is what is called a swidden, that can be used to then grow plants. And that is all for section 4.4. We will talk about irrigation methods tomorrow, but I think that this is good for today. And I will talk to you tomorrow.